My name is Marcella Rowan, and at 72 I thought I had already lived through all the letting go a woman could bear. I let go of my husband, Victor. Far too young, he was a high school principal with a steady voice and an easy laugh. And when cancer carried him off, I raised our son alone. I let go of nights to myself, of dreams of travel, of 1,000 small indulgences, so Adrian could have new shoes for basketball and a chance at the college Victor and I once whispered about on the porch of our old craftsman-style home. That house was more than wood and brick. Its creaking staircase carried every step of Adrian's childhood, every Christmas morning, every thunderstorm when he crept into my bed. I painted the kitchen yellow after Victor's funeral, promising myself that light could live where grief had settled. For 40 years, that house was my anchor. Then Adrian married Celine. She was younger than him, sharp-tongued but ambitious, determined that her children, my grandchildren, would grow up in the best school district money could buy. I had saved and scrimped for decades, and when Celine pressed Adrian's hand and said, "The only way is if your mother contributes," I heard my son's silence louder than any demand. So I did the unthinkable. I sold the house Victor and I built our life in. The house I thought I would leave only in a casket. $200,000 went directly into the down payment of Adrian and Celine's so-called forever home. On the day the movers carted off my last box of teacups, I stood alone in that yellow kitchen. My fingers traced the counter, worn smooth by decades of meals. The air still smelled faintly of lemon polish. I gave them everything, I whispered, closing the door behind me, even my memories. Surely they'll make me feel wanted. And with that, I stepped into the unfamiliar silence of their larger house, believing sacrifice could buy me a place. The house Adrian and Celine chose gleamed like something from a magazine. 5 bedrooms, vaulted ceilings, glass so clean it caught every slant of sunlight. I was given the downstairs guest suite, a neat box tucked away from the open concept Celine was so proud of. She called it efficiency. I knew it was distance. At first, I convinced myself it didn't matter. Lyra and Mason would fly into my arms after school, their backpacks thudding against me as they begged for stories. We ate dinners around a table big enough for 12, laughter bouncing across the polished floors. For a few brief weeks, it almost felt like family. But slights began to creep in, so small I nearly excused them. When I cooked stew, the way Victor liked it, Celine leaned over my shoulder with a smile too tight to be kind. Maybe less salt next time. Marcella, the children don't need heavy food. One morning, I found my antique teapot missing from the shelf. Later, I saw it shoved in a box in the garage, hidden as though it embarrassed her pristine counters. And always came the warnings: don't give them sweets after dinner. You'll spoil them. Don't buy Mason that toy truck. He needs to learn patience. I bit my tongue, telling myself it was her way of mothering, that I should stay out of the way. Adrian, when I tried to mention it, only shrugged. You know how particular Celine is. Don't take it personally. Mom. The hardest blow came not from her, but from the women she entertained. One Saturday afternoon, I overheard them in the kitchen, their voices dripping with casual cruelty. Her mother-in-law sold her house just to move in. Imagine giving up independence like that. Their laughter clinked against wine glasses, and I stood frozen, the words striking deeper than they could have known. Still, I told myself patience would win respect. Surely kindness would be noticed. Eventually, I returned to my room, quietly stacking the receipts of groceries I had bought, as though proof of my place could be measured on paper. Life in Celine's house seemed to come with a running tab, and I was the one keeping it afloat. I paid the utilities when the bills came in, stocked the refrigerator with groceries, and quietly covered Lyra's art classes and Mason's soccer fees. No one asked me outright. But the expectation hung heavy, as if my worth was measured only in what I could provide. One afternoon, while sorting through envelopes piled on the kitchen counter, I noticed a mortgage statement. My eyes lingered on the bold header, then drifted lower there. In black and white was my name. Somehow, through all the paperwork and signatures, Celine had never removed me from the deed. Legally, I still owned part of this house. A rush of conflicting emotions surged through me. Pride, because it meant I wasn't just some guest. Anger, because Celine clearly didn't want me to realize this. I folded the paper back carefully, slipping it into my purse before anyone noticed. It may be my only shield, if I ever need it, I thought, holding on to that silent piece of power. That night, I sat in my room, remembering the day Victor and I signed the deed for our first home. His hand had been warm over mine as we signed together, our names side by side, proof of a future we built with sweat and sacrifice. To think that decades later, I would sit humiliated in a corner of a house I partly owned, it was almost too much to bear. At dinner a few evenings later, Celine's voice cut sharp across the table. "This isn't your house. Marcella, it's ours. Please remember that." The silverware stilled. Adrian stared at his plate, silent, as though his words had been taken from him, or perhaps he'd chosen not to have any. I forced myself to sip water calmly. Though my hand trembled against the glass, she believed I had no place here, yet the truth sat quietly in my purse, waiting for the day it might matter. Celine loved hosting dinners, the kind with neighbors and colleagues seated around a polished table, candles flickering as though we were on the cover of a magazine. I busied myself in the kitchen, setting out dishes I had prepared earlier, careful not to intrude too much. I knew how she liked the spotlight. During the meal, Lyra nudged her peas to the side of her plate, as children often do, gently. I leaned toward her and said with a smile, "Sweetheart, a few more bites will help you grow strong." Before the words could even settle, Celine's voice sliced through the chatter. "Marcella, really, you don't need to hover. The children don't need constant correction." A few guests chuckled politely. Uncertain whether it was a joke, I felt the heat rise to my face. But I tried to brush it aside. I reached for my water glass, hoping the moment would pass. It didn't. When Lyra tried to push her plate away again, I murmured, "Just one more bite, darling." That was when Celine turned fully toward me, her smile fixed, but her tone sharp enough to draw blood. "Know your place in this house, Marcella." The clinking of cutlery stopped. Silence spread like a shadow. Adrian stared down at his plate, as though the grain of the wood had suddenly become fascinating. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I forced a tight smile, swallowing the humiliation that threatened to choke me. The conversation stumbled back to life eventually, but I barely tasted the food on my plate. I excused myself early, retreating to my small downstairs room. There, I opened the shoebox I kept hidden beneath the bed. Inside were the receipts, groceries, utility payments, activity fees, evidence of every way I had carried this family. I ran my fingers across the faded ink, my throat tight. "If they want me to know my place," I whispered into the quiet, "maybe I need to remind them who built this place." Some nights, when Celine's words echoed too loudly in my head, I found myself drifting back to the years when Adrian was small and the world rested squarely on my shoulders. I was 32 when Victor died, leaving me with a boy of 7 and a stack of hospital bills. I went back to the hospital where I'd trained, picking up double shifts as a nurse. Sleep became a luxury. I learned to eat in hurried gulps between rounds, to stitch my own hems when uniforms wore thin, to stretch every paycheck until it begged for mercy. Victor had left a life insurance policy. Modest, but enough if guarded carefully. That money became the lifeline for Adrian's education. It paid for his textbooks, his tuition, the dorm fees he never realized weren't covered by loans. Celine liked to boast about how Adrian's career was built on hard work and smart choices. And though both were true, she never knew the real foundation, a widow's overtime hours and a father's last gift carefully guarded. I remembered the sacrifices vividly, skipping vacations, telling Adrian we'd make fun at home while I stood in the break room counting tips from the extra shifts. I went hungry sometimes, ensuring he never did. All those nights alone, all those shifts. I whispered to myself one evening, staring at the receipts in my shoebox. It was so he would never feel abandoned, and now I feel abandoned in his house. But even in this new, cold home, light seeped in through small cracks, some nights. After Celine and Adrian were asleep, Lyra or Mason would slip into my room, their faces pale from nightmares. They would curl against me, whispering, "Grandma feels safe." Their tiny arms around me felt like proof that my presence still mattered as I stroked their hair and listened to their steady breathing. A clarity began to settle. If I had carried Adrian through storms, I could carry myself through this too, and I would no longer pretend that their erasure of me was acceptable. Something inside me was beginning to steady, as if preparing for the next step. I began to gather my armor in silence. Late at night, while the house slept, I copied every document I could find, utility bills with my name on them, receipts stacked in neat piles, transfers from my bank account into theirs. I even made a careful duplicate of the mortgage deed, the one that still bore my name. Each page slid into a binder, a shield I prayed I would never have to raise, but knew I must keep close. One afternoon, I took the train downtown and walked into the office of Clara Vance, an old friend from nursing days who had gone on to practice law. She listened patiently as I unfolded the years of small humiliations, then tapped the papers I laid before her. "Marcella, you have more rights here than they want you to believe," she said firmly. "Don't let silence convince you otherwise." When I returned home, the divide was clearer than ever. School permission slips arrived with only Celine's signature. Family portraits hung in the hallway without my face among them. At dinner, Celine leaned close to Adrian, whispering words I wasn't meant to hear but caught anyway. "We need to start downsizing Grandma's role. The kids are too attached." The words landed like stones. I felt the old sting of invisibility, but this time, it did not hollow me out. I touched the binder hidden in my room and breathed a little easier. They thought I was powerless, someone they could erase without consequence. I let them believe it, smiling quietly across the table. Even as Adrian avoided my gaze, inside, I felt the weight of my papers like armor across my chest. For the first time in years, I no longer felt helpless. It had been a long day, and I wanted to make things easier for everyone. On my way home from the pharmacy, I picked up takeout from the family's favorite diner, fried chicken for Adrian, pasta for Celine, and little cartons of mac and cheese for Lyra and Mason. I set the bags on the table, thinking maybe, for once, we could share a peaceful meal. But before the first bite, Celine's voice cut across the table. "We don't need you buying things. Marcella, you're just confusing the kids." I froze with the serving spoon in my hand. Before I could answer, Mason piped up, his small voice carrying louder than he knew. "But Grandma pays for everything, even the lights." The words dropped like stones in water. The room went utterly silent. Lyra stared at her plate. Adrian's fork hovered midair. Celine's cheeks flushed crimson, and her eyes darted toward me with a glare sharp enough to slice through bone. "Enough," she snapped. "This is my house, not yours." You need to stop acting like you belong here. The silence that followed was heavy. Adrian muttered, "Let's not fight." His eyes fixed firmly on the table. I set my fork down carefully. As if even the sound of metal on china might shatter what was left of the moment, my voice was calm. Steadier than I felt. "You're right. Celine, I do need to know my place." No one spoke after that. The meal ended in hushed clatter. Dishes cleared without conversation. That night, in the privacy of my small room, I opened my binder. I sat at the desk and began to draft my plan, canceling the auto payments, cutting off the quiet streams of money that had kept this household running. With each stroke of the pen, I felt a piece of myself return. They had asked me to know my place. Soon, they would see exactly what that meant. I moved quietly, the way a nurse prepares a room before the patient even knows something has changed. First, I canceled the auto payments for utilities, then the insurance policies, the groceries, the after-school programs. One by one, I untied the strings that had been holding their world together. It didn't take long. Within weeks, the Wi-Fi was cut off. Mason was benched from soccer because the fees hadn't been paid. Lyra's dance academy sent a polite but firm letter without tuition. She could not continue. The house that once hummed with activity began to fray at its edges. Adrian cornered me in the kitchen, panic lining his face. "Mom, what's happening? Why is everything falling apart?" I folded a dish towel calmly. "I'm respecting your wife's wishes," I said. "She told me this isn't my house, that I don't belong here. I'm simply acting accordingly." He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. He turned away instead, shoulders slumped. What he didn't know, and what Celine never suspected, was that I had already gone further. With Clara's guidance, I quietly sold my share of the house to an outside buyer. The ink was dry before Celine realized the co-owner of her forever home wasn't her. The storm broke soon after. Shouts rattled the walls late into the night. Accusations. Blame. Demands, Adrian and Celine tearing at each other while the children huddled in their rooms. I listened from downstairs, my heart heavy, but resolute. Their house was collapsing, not from my absence alone, but from the cracks that had always been there. I had simply stopped filling them with my sacrifices. And as their voices rose upstairs, I knew it was only the beginning of the unraveling. When the papers were signed and the last box carried from that house, I took a small apartment in Evanston. It wasn't grand, just 2 rooms and a balcony that overlooked a leafy park where children played in the afternoons. To me, it was a palace. I unpacked slowly, savoring each item: Victor's well-worn books, the framed photographs that once hung forgotten in Celine's hallway, and the teapot she had shoved into the garage. I placed pots of roses along the balcony rail, their blooms a splash of color against the city's steady hum. It didn't take long for neighbors to notice. Passing couples would nod and say, "You're the elegant lady with the roses." Children pointed out the blossoms when they ran by. In that small recognition, I felt more seen than I had in years beneath Selene's roof. For the first time since Victor's death, I lived entirely on my own terms. Meals were eaten when I pleased. The quiet belonged to me. The space no longer smelled of someone else's disapproval. Each morning, I opened the balcony door, breathed in the scent of roses, and felt the weight of my sacrifices lift, one petal at a time. One evening, Adrian came by. His face looked older than his years, drawn tight with guilt. He stood in my doorway, twisting his hands like a boy caught in some long-ago mischief. "Mom," he said finally, his voice breaking, "I should have defended you." I looked at him for a long moment, remembering the boy I carried through storms, the man who sat silent while his wife cut me down. A son should never have to be reminded to defend his mother, I told him gently. Though the ache in my chest was sharp, he nodded, tears brimming but unshed. When he left, I returned to my balcony, fingers brushing the petals of a rose. Grief still lived in me. But so did peace. For the first time in decades, my life no longer revolved around people who demeaned me. It revolved around my own dignity. And the roses blooming quietly in the sun, the months that followed unfolded with a quiet inevitability, without my hand steadying the bills, without my money filling the cracks. Adrian and Celine were forced to sell the house they had once called their forever home. The mortgage weighed too heavy. The upkeep, too much. They downsized into a rental half the size, its walls thinner, its corners crowded with the arguments they could no longer avoid. I heard from neighbors that Celine no longer smiled quite so brightly, and Adrian looked like a man carrying stones in his pockets. Meanwhile, my apartment in Evanston thrived with life. The roses stretched taller along the balcony, bright blooms against the city's shifting seasons. The grandchildren came often, running into my arms as though distance had never been placed between us. One afternoon, Lyra pressed her face into my shoulder and whispered, "Grandma's place is wherever she wants it to be." Mason nodded solemnly beside her, and in that moment I felt more rooted than in any deed or contract. When Adrian visited again, he looked tired, his voice softer than before. "Everything I built," he admitted, eyes on the floor, "was because of you. I see that now." I reached for his hand, weathered fingers against mine. Forgiveness rose in me, but so did resolve. Love without respect isn't love, I told him. It's servitude, and I'll never live that again. He nodded, the silence between us heavy but honest this time. We sat like that for a while, two people finally speaking a language neither had managed under Celine's roof. Later, I watered the roses, watching droplets cling to their petals like pearls. The evening light softened the park beyond, and I whispered to the blooms, "I know my place now. It's where I am valued. Because in the end, you can't buy your place in someone's heart, but you can choose your place in the world and claim it with dignity."